Hi there and welcome to The Real Agenda with me, Tom Burgess. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Now today we talk about how we could abolish all taxation and still have enough public funds to pay for all the services that government provides its people. Does that sound too good to be true? Well, it isn't. But it does need a big change of mindset as to how we treat the limited, precious resource of land. As Mark Twain advised, buy land, they're not making it anymore. And therein lies the problems. Just before we start, a special thanks to our sponsors, Switch, the workstation for your browser. Do you find yourself with too many tabs open and losing your place? Try switchextension.com. Free to download. Save yourself time. I do, and it's great. Now back to the show. Today we talk to someone who knows a recession when he sees one. In fact, a long time before anybody else. He's been widely acclaimed as the only commentator to get the timing of the 2007 recession correct. Notably, he warned Gordon Brown, then UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, as far back as 1997, that a global financial crisis would be triggered when house prices peaked in 2007 and it would turn down into a depression in 2010. Now that man is Fred Harrison. Fred is Research Director of the London-based Land Research Trust. He's a graduate of the Universities of Oxford and London. His first book, The Power of the Land, which came out in 1983, predicted the economic crisis of 1992. He followed this with a 10-year forecast, which was published in The Chaos Makers in 1997. Also, Fred was part of a team of economists that advised Russia after the breakup of the USSR, when the Russian government had a unique opportunity to do things differently and better, as effectively the state owned the land. But instead, as a result of pressure from Western capitalist nations and businesses, they went the same old capitalist route, where a small number bought the land and state assets and became very rich at the expense of the rest of the population. This created what we now call the oligarchs, who have been able to buy assets, including football clubs, right across the world, furthering the rise of the all-powerful wealthy few. Such a pity that opportunity was missed. It just further demonstrates the strong influence of wealth. Now, if we can fully understand the issue that Fred talks about, we can find a path towards a sustainable economy. But until we do, we will not fully resolve the fact that millions suffer unnecessary financial hardship every day, while the rich get richer. It's all about how we manage land, that precious resource which is in very limited supply. Now, I have a strong personal interest in what Fred says, as my dad was an economist, and he wrote a book called Public Revenue Without Taxation. And Fred is one of those people that gets what he was talking about. So I'm very keen to hear how we can ensure that we all share in the prosperity that we all help to create. I started by saying to Fred, now you predicted the last two recessions 10 years in advance. What's the current state of the economy, and is there anything we can do about it?
The governments in the Western world are all talking about building back better. The President, Joe Biden in the States, and Boris Johnson here in the UK, they think that they have a formula for recovering from the COVID crisis and somehow charting a new course, resetting the economy into a better future. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where they're going to be proved to be wrong, as those who followed the same policies in the past have always proved to be wrong. In the book that I'm currently writing, I actually lay out the reasons why their Build Back Better promise is going to turn out falsely, because they are using policies that actually undermine the aspirations of people who really would like to rebuild their lives after the pandemic. It all does, in fact, come back ultimately to the land question. Why is that? Well, look at housing policies. Both Joe Biden and here in Britain, the Johnson government are saying that they will bias and are actively biasing their policies to help people to buy their homes. Now that sounds very humane, very attractive. Biden thinks that this will help to somehow overcome the racial prejudice problem in the States. Well, actually the reverse is achieved, because when governments intervene with money and policies that are designed to accelerate the house buying population, what they actually ultimately do is bump up the price of land. And in doing that, they're actually undermining the entrepreneurial economy. They are shifting wealth into the hands of those who own rent-yielding assets. So they're defeating themselves. So ultimately, the crisis that we have in the Western democracies is a philosophical one. The academics won't grapple with the land question. It's excluded from their economic modeling. They only emphasize labor and capital. Land is now a forgotten factor of production. And so there is no debate at the highest levels of politics about how the privatized land market switches the benefits from initiatives like those that Biden and Boris Johnson are actually implementing to undermine the aspirations of the population at large. That's the fundamental problem.
When you say the land question, what do you mean?
Take Boris Johnson's efforts at pumping money or tax benefits into the housing market, the help to buy and so on, getting people onto the property ladder. What that does, it gives power. No, I'll correct myself. It doesn't give power. The power already exists among those who own land, and that includes us existing homeowners who own the plots of land. It gives us the extra power to increase our prices for those who want to get into the housing market. So the land problem stems from the fact that land is one of the three factors of production that's fixed in supply. If we want more labor or more capital equipment, we can move it around to achieve the best levels of productivity. But we can't do that with land. And this is a theory that's been well understood for 200 years. Land is fixed in supply, and therefore it has the whip hand when the ownership is in private hands. So the problem is that when governments redesign their tax system, or when the private sector advances productivity, for example, the digital economy, these advances help to reduce the costs of production, which ought to be good news. But actually, by reducing the costs of production, they are actually allowing the owners of land to increase their extraction of rents out of the economy. So it makes it harder for people to buy a home or to start a business or to sustain the rents that they're paying, which is why we have homelessness, unaffordable housing, and all those crises which stem from the one natural reality that land is in fixed supply. And that is where problems start from once the rents that are accumulated by the people who own the land is allowed to diminish the flow of the revenue that ought to be pooled for the common good.
So what you're saying is these policies are actually making things worse.
Exactly. That's the tragedy. And when you read the Financial Times or the other newspapers today, you actually see them describing that process. They say, the Chancellor has agreed to extend the benefits for people who are buying homes. The benefits, though, don't go to the people who need to buy the homes. The result of these initiatives is to bump up the price of homes. So instead of making it easier for people to acquire their homes, it becomes even more expensive. And that's the opposite of what they say they're supposed to be doing. So it's an insanity on a political, national scale. It's insane.
How can we overcome that? How could that be changed?
It can only be changed by reversing the course of history that's been unfolding for 500 years. In other words, it's not the practical challenges that's involved of implementing a change to the tax regime where we would gather up more revenue from the rent of land and reduce the tax burden on wages and the people who are investing in value-adding enterprises. That's an easy-to-achieve mechanism because actually it's already in practice elsewhere in the world. The big problem is a moral one. The majority of people in Britain today, for example, are homeowners, them and their families. Yes, some of them are paying mortgages, but they nonetheless are the owners of homes under which there is land. And that land gives them a capital gain. It's an unearned capital gain. And any talk of reversing the history that's brought us to the brink that our world is in at the present time is resisted because of the fear of losing the capital gains from land. The only solution to the crisis then is reversing the structure of the fiscal system, the tax regime, by rebalancing it, not taking more money from anybody, but shifting the way we draw that revenue, drawing it direct from land values, or rather the rent of land, and concurrently reducing the tax burden on people who work for their living.
So what you're saying is then that we should tax wealth more and tax income less?
Well, no, that's the popular way of putting it, but you see, it leads to a trap. When we talk about taxing wealth, we're not discriminating precisely what we mean. The idea of a wealth tax is gaining traction around the world today, but look, wealth is both earned wealth and unearned wealth. And why do we want to tax wealth that people have worked hard to accumulate? The answer is we don't, or at least we oughtn't to. Rather, we should be concerned with that stream of income that is unearned and which is capitalized into so-called wealth. So we really do need to be careful with our language, because those who want to preserve the status quo because they get rich by it are very happy that the language we use leads us into policy initiatives that reinforce their monopoly over the rent of land. So, yes, we need to switch from taxing people's wages to drawing more revenue from the annual rental income of land and all natural resources.
So it's not so much taxing wealth, it's taxing land and then income less.
It's taxing the flow of rent. You see, again, there's the trap with that word land. Land might be of very low value, and in marginal areas, it is indeed low. Some people hold large plots of land of low value, and if we based the charge on land, that leads to the idea of if you've got more land, you should pay more. But if the land is yielding a very low rent, no, the answer is we should design a revenue regime based on the market rents. And if I may, I would like to caution against using the word land, because you see, the charge on rent is a proportionate levy on the benefits that people receive from the locations that they occupy. Now, that rent is a composite value. It's not only the value of the services of nature, which is represented by the one word land, but it's also represented by the value of the services provided by society, the community at large. So when we choose somewhere to live, we pick a location because of what we access in that area from the community, like hospitals or schools or transport for commuting to work, as well as the natural features provided by nature. So in trying to reformulate policies that really will get the world out of the mess that we're now in, we need to clarify the words that we're using, including words like wealth and land, and even the word tax. The most effective way to raise revenue is not a tax. A tax is what we now have, which is the arbitrary exactions imposed by governments from on high, who decide how much to levy on whom. And people hate the idea of taxes for good reasons. But if they all understand that we need to pay for the services that we receive that are provided by government, then we're talking not about being taxed, we're talking about paying for the services that we receive. And we do that by pooling the rents that we help to generate into the public purse. And so now the moral discourse, the debate, is shifted away from that toxic word tax, which nobody wants to have to pay, onto the onus on the moral onus onto the individual to pool the rental value of the locations where they want to live or work, or to enjoy the benefits provided by nature and society in other ways.
So what you're saying then is we would tax the value of the land, value of nature, and the services that are provided, but this really isn't a tax because you're actually paying for services that you receive, both from nature and from the services
society
provided by the government. And
the beauty of that, and what would make it attractive to people in general, is that it's proportionate. At the moment, if a government ups the income tax, it doesn't do so in relation to the extra services that the taxpayer is going to be receiving. It's an arbitrary levy on your income. Whereas with the paying of a rent, what Adam Smith called the annual ground rent, when you pay that, it's a charge that's proportionate to the services that each of us is actually receiving. It's like going into Sainsbury's or Tesco's, filling up the basket, and when you go to the checkout point, they don't just say, oh, well, pay us £100. No, they measure what you've collected off the shelves that you have chosen, and they say, this is what you need to pay. And we're happy to pay it. And if we don't want to pay it, we don't take the goods off the shelves. And that's how a ground rent pooled into the public purse operates. It's proportionate to what I, as a homeowner, want to receive in the location where I want to live.
So, in fact, what could happen is then that we would not, in fact, be paying a tax. We'd just be paying a service charge. Now, would that cover everything that our governments, whether they're local or national, would provide for us? I mean, is that going to be enough if we raise it that way to cover everything? Could we abolish income tax?
Yes, the answer is we can change all of existing taxes. Now, one of the objections to this proposal raised by academics is that, the problem is, although that's a good idea as a charge, it wouldn't raise enough revenue. So you can't have a single tax, as they used to call it. Well, that's wrong. And it's wrong for another reason why economics is a discipline that currently, as practiced, is not fit for purpose. The truth is this, Tom. We're already paying rent through our income taxes, corporation taxes, and so on. In the main, those taxes are collected out of rent, but they're collected indirectly. They're collected the long way round, the hard way. Instead of the government saying, we're just going to have a single charge on rent in all its forms, in which case, and no other taxes, in which case rent would be actually more than sufficient to cover existing public services. They don't do that. Instead, they have the current tax regime. And that tax regime, therefore, reduces the amount of rent that remains visible in the economy. In other words, what we have is what is called by an acronym ATCOR. All taxes actually come out of rent. But because we don't collect that rent the efficient, easy, optimum way, which is directly, because we collect that rent indirectly via income and VAT, etc., taxes, we camouflage the amount of rent that's actually in the economy, which then leads the professional economist to say, oh, God blimey, there's not enough rent left to pay for all the taxes. So, yes, Tom, there is more than enough rent to pay for all the public services and to eliminate those taxes that actually reduce the productivity in the economy by distorting people's incentives and behavior.
So we could raise sufficient public revenue to cover everything without taxation.
Correct. It will be done, as we were just saying, as a proportionate charge. If you want all these services by living in the middle of London, then you're going to have to pay for them. If you don't want to pay for them, you can live in a lower value location where the rents are lower, but what you pay is proportionate to what you get. So what you pay by pooling into the public purse is a matter of choice, not the government saying, you, Fred Harrison, will pay 10% of your earned income and you've got no choice about it, mate. No, I decide how much I pool into the public purse by deciding where I want to live or where I want to work, where I want to set up my factory or office. It's an individual choice. But collectively, as a result of all those choices, we end up producing sufficient revenue to pay for all the public services and all the amenities that a government, a state government, has to provide for the protection and happiness of its population.
So you obviously read the book then, Public Revenue Without Taxation.
Indeed. And please give it a plug.
I will, yes. It's an excellent book called Public Revenue Without Taxation, written by Ronald Burgess, who
is not distantly removed from Tom Burgess.
That's right, who was in fact my father, my late father. But anyway, and it's so good talking to you, Fred, to get this message over. What we're saying here is that we could actually abolish income tax. We could in fact abolish all taxes, and it would be replaced by a charge on rent. Is that right?
Correct. I realise that this is a moral dilemma for a large number of people, and I address that in book 2 of the book that I'm currently working on, which is called #WeAreRent.
How can we get this message over to people, and how can we make this change happen? I mean, because I think if people really understood it, they would think, well, this is a great idea. It makes a lot of sense. So how do we get that message over, and how do we make change happen?
We are in a period now, as we come out of the pandemic, that is as good a time as ever in my lifetime since 1945 to effect the change, because people are actually asking, let's build back better. Others are saying we need a new narrative to achieve that change. People are willing to search for alternatives. And so what we have to do is provide the narrative and stimulate the public conversation so that the politicians who tend to be conservative, including those who are on the left, who tend to want to just retain things as they are, create the mass public mobilization of awareness of people who end up mandating the change. They did it 100 years ago. The election of 1906 was a landslide endorsement of the Liberal Party's proposal to introduce what they then called a land tax, which they did in the budget of 1909. It was a publicly mandated change. And we can do that again today, what with social media and so on, and the capacity to communicate on a large scale. But we have to get that conversation, national conversation going in order to mandate the politicians to make the change.
That's very interesting, Fred. I think what we would like to do is talk about this again, because I think it's so important that we get this message over.
I think your idea about an evolving conversation is great, because that's what it's going to take, where enough people... You see, in this country alone, there are something like 700 groups that are struggling to visualize new political processes, how to amend the democratic system in order to make it more effective. Now, they've got to be merged into some kind of a coalition, united behind a conversation that leads to the mandate for change. Otherwise, if we all remain isolated in our little groups, nothing's going to happen. And that will lead to the disaster that I'm forecasting, which is that by 2026, house prices will peak. That will lead to a collapse even worse than what we saw in 2008. So your proposal that there should be a evolving conversation through all kinds of media, including the kind of podcasts that you're doing, is the way forward.
That's great, Fred. Thank you so much for that, and we'll look forward to talking to you further about this and see if we can get more of a national conversation going.
You're welcome.
Wow, thanks, Fred. That's most informative, and I hope Wow, thanks, Fred. That's most informative. You can find out more about Fred's work at wearerent.com or landresearchtrust.org, or you can follow Fred on Twitter, which is at Geophilus. I'll spell that Geophilos. So hopefully this has helped you appreciate that to resolve the extreme economic inequality and the unnecessary financial hardship suffered by millions every day, we need to take a giant step, not just paper over the cracks. It takes moral courage by our politicians to shift the tax balance from income to wealth, and more specifically land. Think about it. No more income tax, no more VAT. You would just pay a charge on the land you own, and only those that own land would pay. It could happen, but politicians are not bold enough, and the vested interests of landowners are keeping it off the agenda. Now this needs to stop for the good of us all. All Fred's books are available from all good booksellers or directly from the publisher. That's Shepherd Walwyn. That's Shepherd with an H-E-A-R-D and Walwyn, W-A-L-W-Y-N. This publisher has many good books in its ethical economic series, including From Here to Prosperity by Thomas Burgess, that's me, and Public Revenue Without Taxation by Ronald Burgess, that's my dad. More at shepherdwalwyn.com, and also on the Shepherd Walwyn podcast from all main podcast providers. So what do you think? Do contact us on info@realagendaradio.org or Twitter @realagendanet, and via our website realagenda.org. We'd love to hear your views, and if you're polite, you could receive a signed copy of my book, From Here to Prosperity. We hope that we have helped to inform, involve, and inspire you into action. So what's up next? Well, we're really excited that we've got more and more of you listening to the Real Agenda Network over recent months. There's always plenty to choose from on the Real Agenda Network. We offer a range of related shows on this channel. We've recently added podcasts from Extinction Rebellion, the IPPR, the New Economics Foundation, Forgiveness and the Forgiveness Project, in addition to podcasts from organisations like Compass, Compassion in Politics, the Equality Trust, Tax Justice Network, Taxpayers Against Poverty, and Unlock Democracy. So do listen in, subscribe to our podcast with your podcast provider, and you will receive it in your podcast inbox. A special thanks to our sponsors, Switch, the workstation for your browser. Do you find yourself with too many tabs open and losing your place? Try switchextension.com. It's free to download and you can save yourself time, because I do, and it's great. One thing is certain. People want to see change to a more compassionate and just society, as well as more courageous politicians prepared to do the right thing for people over party. It's not happening, but it can. It's urgent and it's up to us to make it happen. That's the real agenda. I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.